Hi, and welcome to episode 135 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tariq.
And thanks for joining us on the podcast, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing journeys, find out how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. This is one of a special series of episodes that we've recorded with industry experts to try and find out how you get your book from that perfect written manuscript that you've got to being published and possibly even being made in Hollywood. So we've spoken to agents, we've spoken to editors, we've spoken to Hollywood managers. We've had a couple of episodes with some brilliant agents on already, but we've got another agent on today who I believe you might know, Tariq.
I do know of this man. Jamie Cowen is his name. He's actually my agent, and he's a fantastic guy. He looks after people like Tendai Huchu, Mark Hill, and he's has a really interesting list that covers crime, thrillers, sci-fi, fantasy, whole smorgasbord. And again, much like we've chatted to agents in the past, he's got some really good tips and advice. What does he look for in that manuscript? What does he look for in your cover letter, in your sample chapters? All the really stuff, all the good stuff that people need to know when they're submitting.
Yeah, I think what's been good about these episodes with agents is that just that practical side of advice that we can all look on the internet and find out what you need to do to try and make your submission, but the practical advice of what they're actually looking for, what's important to them when they're actually looking at the query is invaluable. So I hope that you find these episodes as valuable as I have found them personally, and we'll get straight into the interview with Jamie now.
But on with the podcast.
On a normal podcast, I would ask, did you always want to be a writer? But I mean, did you, how did you come to be a literary agent?
As with a lot of these things, kind of a chunk of luck and quite a lot of hard work. And I suppose this is also luck as well, but being in the right place at the right time. So yeah, a combination of those things really. So shall I give you the kind of career backstory?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. I'll make it as brief as I can. So my mum always worked in publishing. She was a copy editor and a desk editor, and then a managing editor at Pan Macmillan for quite a long time. That was at the end of her career. So for quite a lot of that time, she was freelance, so she would work from home as I now do. She, I suppose, largely was the person to get me into books and into reading. And I think it was probably in 2003 or something that I was loafing about the house of a Tuesday at about 11 o'clock, having quit a previously dreadful job. And she whacked me about the head with a copy of the bookseller and just said, well, look, why don't you just think about applying for some jobs in publishing, which I'd never considered. Obviously, I knew a little bit about the industry from her having done the jobs that she's done for so long. She had done for so long. She's retired now. So I did. I applied for about 15 jobs and got one interview for a job as a contracts assistant at HarperCollins. And I went in, did the interview, really liked the people. They apparently really liked me, went for a second interview and then got offered the job, which I took. So I didn't really know much about being a contracts assistant or working in contracts. I didn't know what contracts people even were at publishing houses. Basically, it turned out that they are the publishing industry's cheap and cheerful way of getting around having to employ lots of lawyers, which is the music industry and the film and TV industry's preferred route. Yeah. So they basically have teams of effectively trained up paralegals that work for them and do all of their permission stuff. They do a lot of the kind of contracts drafting and negotiating. And I found that to be a really cool job. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed getting to know the legal kind of underbelly of what underpins all of those big deals that you read about on the TV. But also just to be involved with books. I think if it had been a similar job in another industry, I think I would have been bored out of my mind. But actually, because I knew that what I was doing was helping to kind of get books in front of people, that made it fun and worthwhile. I also enjoyed the kind of detailed nature of it. I really enjoyed the kind of checking of contracts, the haggling over bits and pieces. I've got some quite kind of amusing stories about accidentally pressing send, for example, on an email to the lawyer that was in charge of the Dr. Zeus estate, who I was negotiating a contract with. And I wrote the angry version of the email with the intention of then going back. And I was just kind of flapping away at the keyboard and hit Control Enter and sent it straight to him. He was very nice about it, and I, scrabbled around and tried to recall it and do all of those deeply cringing and embarrassing things.
Never worked.
But I really enjoyed that job. I then went on and got a promotion there of a sort, and was there in the end for about 5 years. Then moved and did that job for Hodder. Then went back again to HarperCollins, all for little kind of gradual promotions. And I was back at HarperCollins doing that job for about 3 years when I got offered a job as an editor. So I then and that's where some of the hard work comes in, because in order to make that jump, I've been doing a lot of reading for a few editors around the building, and kind of generally spreading the word that I was interested in making the leap, and then got a couple of opportunities to do that and took one of them. Had a kind of mixed time, I would say, being politically correct as an editor at HarperCollins. That's my dog going mental.
Sorry.
So yeah, had a bit of a mixed time working as an editor at HarperCollins. Basically, the person who hired me quite quickly departed the scene, and some of the other people there probably were less than keen for me to be around. But anyway, it was an amazing job, which I loved to do. I loved working with the authors. I loved doing the editing that I did. Really, really enjoyed that. But eventually that came to an end, shall we say. Probably about 18 months, I think I was doing that job. And then by that point, I'd realized that there was no going back. I didn't want to go back to doing a back office job. I did little bits of that in a freelance sense, along with doing some freelance editing work too, which I really enjoyed. But then bumped into my now boss, Peter Buckman, at a launch party of a mutual friend's book, a woman called Amy McCulloch, to whom I have a lot to thank. And I bumped into Peter again. He'd actually pitched me a book while I'd been an editor at HarperCollins, which I'd really liked and tried quite hard to buy. And we got on really well, went for a really good lunch in Hammersmith. Got on really well. We then bumped into each other again at this party. And he said that he was looking for somebody to bring in as an agent at Ampersand, to which I said, well, that sounds really exciting. He said, should we go and have another lunch, this time in Oxford? And I said, yes, please. We had a very, very nice lunch, during which he offered me a job. I accepted on the spot and have been doing that for nearly 9 years now. So that's the potted history.
So it sounds like, in terms of working on that side of the publishing industry, as long as you can sort of get a foot in the door in one role, it can be relatively not easy, but there are opportunities to move around into different roles once you're in there. Is that fair to say?
But it depends on what the role is to start with. So it's actually pretty unusual for people to make the move from being a contract or legal person into the editorial
world.
That's quite an unusual move. I know of one other woman, Vicky Meller, who actually used to be my boss, who's now a publisher at Padden Macmillan, actually, previously Headline. She made that leap. I don't know of many others. There probably are some, but I don't know of many. What's a more common leap to make these days is the jump from marketing and publicity to editorial. That happens relatively regularly. So Sam Eads, the woman who is now publisher of Orion Fiction, was previously a publicist, I'm pretty certain. There are a couple of other people that have made similar jumps. Ben Willis, who's now at Bonnier, was previously a publicist as well. So that tends to be a jump that gets made relatively regularly, but less so the kind of job that I did to editorial. What is a relatively common jump is either from agent to editor or editor to agent. Yeah, those jobs they have a lot of crossover, because really what we're doing is working with authors to make their books better and then selling them. In our case, as agents, it's a less collaborative sell than what is typical for an editor, because they usually have quite a lot of meetings and hoops to jump through before they get to the point that they can make an offer to an agent or an author. Whereas with an agent, we're kind of a bit more Lone Ranger-ish, where it's kind of us and our opinions and our view on a book that's really what's important if we're going to decide to take on an author. Particularly in a smaller agency like mine, it's really up to us. If we think that something's incredible, we'll take it on, and that's not really a collaborative process. So, but that aside, I think there are lots of parallels between the role of the kind of day-to-day work that we do is relatively similar if you look at it in a broad sense.
And I mean, as an agent, then, you know, most of the applications that writers will do to agencies will be of a standard sample chapters, query letters, synopsis. And from your point of view, what do you look for? You know, what is it that makes something stand out from the rest?
That's a great question. And if I knew, it's one of those answers, I think, where if I knew the answer to it, I'd be the most successful agent on the planet. It differs in every case. You know, I can think of submissions I've had from clients that I've taken on partly because I was hooked in by something they said in a letter. Sometimes it's something that I've seen them write on Twitter that's made me roar with laughter or made me go, oh my God, I never thought of that. You know, it's that they're, I'm just going to switch my phone's notifications off. 99.9% of the time, it's the writing. In fact, it's always the writing, but sometimes other things can catch your eye as well. I think that's the best way of putting it. Really, I've done kind of sessions where, you know, people have brought me in to kind of give a talk to aspiring authors about how to create the perfect pitch. And you can go so far with that, but really what you're talking about is the writing just has to be incredible. Mm-hmm. And it has to be more than that. It has to be incredible, and it has to appeal to my taste as well. And that's obviously an extraordinarily subjective thing, particularly when you're dealing with fiction, I would say, because what appeals to me in a fantasy novel may very well not appeal to half the other agents that are being submitted to. It just might not be their thing. So really, it's about incredible writing. I think there are things that you can do wrong with a pitch. One of the things that I've been noticing a bit of a rising trend of recently is particularly from male writers, people saying, you're not going to like this book. It's not going to be for you. You're probably not brave enough. You're probably
reverse psychology attempt.
Right. So I'm seeing that as quite it doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened a frankly alarming number of times lately. So you can cock up a pitch, but really the best thing to do in pitches, as you both, I'm certain, know, is just to be yourself, be relatively concise, explain why you submitted to an agent, and then leave it to the writing to do its thing. It's all about the writing for me.
And how important, just staying on the query letter briefly, you know, how important are things like comps or, you know, capturing that pitch in a sentence and things like that? Are those vital, or does it, you know, is it enough to be averaging and average in those sense, and then the pages hopefully can do the rest of the work?
Yeah, I would say the latter. I mean, I think if somebody can write an incredible pitch, that's demonstrating to me that they can write an incredible pitch. It doesn't, or an elevator pitch, or you know, some fantastic comparisons. It's not telling me they can write a brilliant novel. The only way that you can really find that out is to read the samples, right? So it's helpful, but it's certainly not crucial.
Mm-hmm. And what about the synopsis? I mean, obviously, when you get the query letter, you get the sample chapters of maybe the first 3 chapters, etc. But I take it the synopsis is what really tells you where the rest of that book's going, and how. I mean, I take it that's very important. And also, do you want everything spoiled in that? Is that meant to be a total blueprint of where the story goes?
That's another great question. Synopses are notoriously horrible to write. There are like entire courses on how to write synopses, I'm sure, and certainly big chunks of them. What I want from a synopsis is black and white plot breakdown, character breakdown, and every possible spoiler that can be put in there. I want to know everything. There's not really, at that stage of the process, there's not really much point in trying to use a synopsis to draw you in, ... cliffhanger, because I have a sample of your writing. I have a pitch letter, which is the bit that's really supposed to draw me in the first place. And what I need from a synopsis is everything. I need to know every twist, every turn, every death, every bit of magic, every dragon. I need to know all of it in the synopsis in order to be able to judge whether the sample plus that equals a book that I want to read and theoretically want to then go on and potentially sell. So it needs to be exhaustive and totally devoid of cliffhangers, in my opinion.
Exhaustive, but 500 words.
Right. Which is where I go back to the bit where they're obviously horrible to write. I'm so grateful to never have to do that.
Yeah.
In my job, I'm really, really grateful that I don't have to write synopses, because I can imagine them being a total nightmare.
Yeah. And do you take on writers that you can, there's something about the writing or the story or something that grabs you, but it still needs work? Are you one of the agents that will see that potential and want to try and hone it? Do you take people like that on?
Very much so. I think that one of the things, we have to be, as a relatively small agency, we have to be quite conscious of where we are positioned in the market. That sounds very Tesco's like, but I think you probably know what I mean. Like, we have to be aware of what our place is in the kind of wider world. So where agencies like Curtis Brown or bigger agents, I would imagine, have more of an emphasis on taking things on that are like a bigger agency with a big office in the West End or in LA or in New York or wherever. They have big overheads, they have bills to pay, they have junior staff, they have assistant agents, they have admin people, they have legal people. For those guys, they will be taking on books that they will still work on books, of course.
Yeah.
Their eye might be more drawn to something that they think is an automatic. I can sell this for 500 grand, no questions asked. Whereas I think smaller agents like us perhaps have more opportunity to be a bit more open to finding unpolished potential diamonds and doing some work on them. I quite regularly, I've had 2 authors in the relatively recent past whose books I have had to cut from 200,000 words plus down into a more manageable size. Those kinds of things might be looked at by a bigger agency, and they might just think, you know what, I can't. It's going to take me 6 months of work to get that anywhere near submission. But we can do that. I can do that. I don't mind. I'm not frightened by those jobs. So yes, we very much do. We very much do look at that. I do. My colleagues do the same. We're always on the lookout for books that, with a bit of polishing, can be something extraordinary.
And how do you know what is going to be great with some polish and what is unpolishable, or is just something that you aren't able to get to that stage?
It's difficult to put a finger on one thing that makes that the case with a book, but I think that you really learn how to do that by getting it wrong, I think. So I'm sure, I actually can't think of any examples straight away, but I'm sure that I've taken books on that I've worked really hard on and then not sold. And similarly, I've taken books on that I've done lots of work on and have then sold. So I think you kind of learn by working with those books, by working with those writers, to hone your instincts a bit and to learn where something is doable and something might not be. I think the rule of thumb that I say this to clients when I'm thinking about taking them on, the rule of thumb that I try to work by is, if I look at a book and I've read it and I've got an idea of what it is and what I think is brilliant about it and what I think might need some work, if I know instinctively what the things are that I would do to make it better, then I take that as a really good sign. But if I read a book and I think there's something incredible in there, but I just don't know what it is that I would do to bring it out, that's the line for me between offering representation and not. When it comes to a book that needs a reasonable amount of work, I think I need to feel confident in my ability to edit that book to the point where I think it's extraordinary and as good as it could be. And if I don't have that confidence, I think that's usually where I would draw the line and say I'm not sure that I can do it.
And as many authors will, if you only need to look at Twitter or go into writing forums and stuff, there is a, from the author side of things, there can often be a frustration that they'll send things to agents and then never hear anything back and stuff. But on the agent side of things, they're getting hundreds of submissions a week, presumably. How do you balance these things from your point of view?
You often can't. is the simple answer. And I think well, I've noticed recently a rising number of agents actually closing to submissions. And so I think, yeah, you often can't strike that balance. And so sometimes the only thing that you can do is to say, I've got to stop for a bit, catch up with all the editing and selling that I've got to do for my existing clients, get that all done. And then at that stage, you can reopen to submissions when your workload is a little bit less terrifying. And that I've not done that yet, but it is something that I can understand. I can understand why people would do it. I think the other side of that, and I think a lot of old school agents would feel perhaps slightly terrified that by doing so, you would miss out on the one or four or whatever it would be that would come in at the time that you were close to submission. So I can see why people wouldn't do it, but similarly, I can see why they would.
So, I mean, how many, ballpark, how many queries are you receiving a week, for example?
To my personal inbox, it varies between 30 and about 70 a week.
Wow.
So I suppose it averages out around 50. But during lockdown one, particularly towards the end of lockdown one, that was trebled.
Wow.
So we were getting 3 times the number of submissions that we normally get, and it's come down again since that point to something more regular. But there's two things at play. Firstly, as I do this job for longer, more people hear about me and more people find out about what I've done. My name is in the acknowledgements very wonderfully of more books that people read. And so the longer you do it, the better known you become. So there's an automatic kind of increase that happens. But similarly, lockdowns just gave lots of people that hadn't had the opportunity to finish that book the opportunity to do exactly that. So that was why that happened. That was very obvious to me. And plus I was during that time, I was seeking people out as well. I was trying to be, trying to think around that situation. And one of the things that had become clear to me is lots of TV people, comedy writers, musicians were completely out of work. They had nothing to do at all. There was no TV being made. There were no films being made. There was no comedy happening. So I basically just wrote a tweet saying any comedians, TV or film writers that have got, a book idea that they want to take a bit further, drop me a line. And I got an absolute shed load of people writing to me, out of whom I took some clients on eventually. So, there are various reasons for that. But we get to go back to your question, which I've massively tangented away from.
That's fine.
The answer to your question is it's often very difficult to find that balance. You just have to do everything that you can to read every submission that comes in and try, if you can, to give some kind of feedback to all of those that you say no to. We don't have a stock rejection letter at Ampersand, or at least I don't. I think maybe my colleagues might use one from time to time, but we try very, very hard to always give at least some small amount of feedback, even if it's just to say, I'm really sorry, but it just wasn't to my taste. That's something that an author can then go away and use, because if they write something then again, which is very similar to that thing before, they'll know not to send it to you. So that's a tiny thing, but at least it's some kind of feedback. So the answer is you try as hard as you can to answer everything. It's not always possible, if I'm brutally honest.
And when you're an agent and you've got that point where you've had the book and you've signed the client, you have the book, you've done the polish and the edits on it and stuff, and it's the point of getting onto the publisher. Is it important for you to have developed relationships with editors from different publishing houses far in advance, so that you're having discussions constantly to see what kind of thing people are looking for, to try to think in the back of your mind, have I got anything which might fit what they're looking for right now? Is that quite important?
It's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. I think, there are probably loads of quips and one-liners that agents have come out with, or people are describing agents about them only being as good as their contacts list or their little black book or whatever. Yeah. It's absolutely true. We are only as good as the list of people that we have who will take a submission from us seriously. So in order for that to be the case, firstly, of course, we have to be selling books that are then going on to sell reasonable numbers of copies. We also have to be selling books that are demonstrably good. So, some books might go on and sell lots of copies, but not necessarily be the best written in the world. we have to be able to demonstrate on the regular to editors that and publishers that we are people of good taste, that we are doing our job as the first filter to make sure that we're only sending them stuff that is publishable and is going to sell lots of copies and is well edited, because that takes the job out of their hands. You know, if we can sell them really well edited manuscripts that are already in pretty good shape, then it takes a bit of the fear and a bit of the unknown out of that process for the editor, because they may not know, they won't know how easy or otherwise the author is to work with in terms of editing. So there are lots of steps that we can make to make their jobs easier. But to answer your question, excuse me, yes, absolutely. We have to do all of that preparatory work long in advance and regularly. We have to catch up with people and make sure that we're still in touch and still across who's where and who's moved where and what their list is like and what's going on and all of that stuff. It's crucial.
And is there a difference in, because obviously your role is then to make these submissions to the editors in the hope that someone will take it on. Is that submission process different from the author to agent submission process?
There are obvious similarities. You know, for the most part, we will be submitting to multiple editors at once. The purpose of that process is the same. You know, we're attempting to sell. Really, the way that I look at it is that a book will go through a number of different phases where it's attempting to be sold. Mm-hmm. So the first of those, of course, will be, I mean, you could probably even take it back one stage further, and your subconscious attempting to sell an idea to your conscious brain as the writer. But then, of course, once you've got the book written and you're happy with it, you then have to pitch it to agents to effectively sell it to them. We then have to sell it to the editors. The editors will then have to sell it internally.
Yeah.
So if I take on a book and an editor loves it, that's only one step towards an offer popping out at the other end, because the editor then has to pitch that book and sell it convincingly to all of their colleagues internally. If they then make you an offer and it's accepted by the author via the agent, the publisher then has to sell it to the reps from the different bookstores, and they then have to sell it to the people out the other end, the customers who are picking the book up, putting it on the till and paying their money for it. So it's one of, these are two, rather, the author to the agent and the agent to the editor. They're two of myriad selling processes that take place in a book's life. So yes, there are definite similarities for sure. We have to put together a brilliant pitch, which we think is going to be eye-catching. We have to explain why we think the book's going to sell millions upon millions of copies. And we have to convince them to pick that book over any of the hundreds of others they're likely to see on a yearly basis that are similar or in the same ballpark. So there are marked similarities.
Is that pitch that's being put forward? Obviously, sometimes the author will have given you that perfect elevator pitch or whatever in their query letter, but as we spoke about before, sometimes that might be a bit that needs to be a bit honed or whatever. I mean, yeah. How involved is the author in that part of the process, or is that really when they take a step back and that's your role at that point?
Typically not involved at all. That's not because I have any kind of fear or displeasure at the author being involved at that stage, but that really is my job. Mm-hmm. It's my job to put the pitch together in the first place, to tailor that pitch to each individual editor that I'm going to be sending them to. And I'm not sure that, I think there probably comes a point in that process of the agent selling the book where the author actually will be better off stepping away from it. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's probably a point where, of course, they want to know everything about what's going on and who you're sending it to and when it's been sent and what's come back and biting of fingernails and is there anything you can tell me and is there any news? Of course, they'll want to be involved and to understand what's going on, but I think there's probably a point at which it's better for them to be removed from that in order that they can just give it to somebody else, try and kind of forget about it to a certain extent and just hope for the best. I think that's probably quite a healthy way to approach that situation. And ultimately, that's my job. That's what I'm getting, hopefully, paid my commission for. You know, that's the point at which really we have to earn our money.
And how about, book fairs? We had London Book Fair a few months ago now, and is that a fairly massive? Are these book fairs quite massively important in terms of mixing agency editors together? How do they work?
It's really a networking opportunity. If you boil it down to its constituent parts, it's really a big, juicy, very well populated networking opportunity, a book fair. It's quite unusual that books will actually be sold at the fair. So, for example, when you're reading the bookseller does a bunch of issues, usually one a day, during the course of the London Book Fair, for example, the bookseller being the industry magazine that most people in the UK go to for their publishing industry news. The books that you read about being like the book of the fair, a lot of the legwork for those will have been done in the build-up to a book fair, probably even, for most cases, I would say probably would even have been sold before the fair starts, because what the agent will then use the fair to do is to pitch it to all the international publishers that are there, assuming they're representing those rights themselves. So generally speaking, books will not actually be sold from agents to publishers. I'm sure that's happened at some stage, and I'm sure it's happened once or twice here and there, but really you use those opportunities to get editors sat down one after the other for 2.5, 3 days in a row to say hello to them, to find out how they're doing. This is what I usually do. Find out what's new with them, find out what changes there have been in their list, if any, find out what they've bought, furiously make notes about all of that stuff, pitch them some books, of course. I try to not have more than 1 or 2 books to pitch to editors at any one time during London Book Fair meetings, which are usually half an hour long, because who in God's great earth is going to remember the 3rd, 4th or 5th book that they get pitched in a half-hour meeting at the London Book Fair, which is literally dozens of meetings all in a row over 3 days? Nobody is. So the thought of going beyond 1 or even 2 books to me is bonkers. So really what you're talking about there is it's an opportunity to do the same thing that we're doing all the rest of the year outside of the book fair, which is meeting people for drinks, having coffee with editors and publishers, having Zoom meetings, of course, during lockdowns, and also more recently because they're very convenient. There's nothing wrong with a Zoom meeting if you've got, a couple of things to catch up on and a book to tell somebody about. I don't see why you wouldn't do a Zoom. It's also, of course, important to meet people in person, though. So there's always, drinks that are put together by scouts, or, a party to go to. The HarperCollins summer party, for example, is coming up. There will always be that stuff to do as well. So yeah, it's really a gigantic, multitudinal networking opportunity when you boil it right down.
And as an agent, you're a smaller agency, I think it's fair to say. Are you someone that has a sort of ideal number of clients in your head, or are you always on the lookout for new talent?
The latter, in my case. I'm always looking out for new talent. Different agents have different ethoses, who knows, when it comes to this stuff. So actually our agency is a really great example. So where at the one end you have Peter, who has dozens of clients, somewhere I think approaching 40 or 50. Anne-Marie Dalton, our other primary agent, has a much, much smaller, more refined, she would say, I'm sure, list. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I think I've got somewhere like 22, 23 clients at the moment. For somebody who's been doing my job as long as I have, 22 or 23 clients is quite a small number. I think a lot of people who've been doing the job for nearly 10 years would probably be closer to where Peter is, but I'm very, very picky, and I've learned to be okay with that. I'm a relatively successful agent in terms of hit rate. I sell many more books than I don't, which I'm very happy about. I think I probably could be a bit less choosy, if I'm honest. I think one of the things that you're always I think it's dangerous to second guess yourself, of course, but and always play to your strengths. That's true. But it's also important, I think, to be entrepreneurial in our job and to try to see opportunities when they come along and not turn them down because you think you might have 1 or 2 too many clients and you're worried that you're not being choosy enough. So there's a balancing act to be struck there. I think it's always best to trust your instincts. But yes, we are a smaller agency, and there's always a point where you've got too much to do, and I think that's important too. I am very much on the working in order to live side of things. I'm not, I don't allow my job to completely consume every waking hour. There are lots of agents that work far longer hours than me and work far harder, and that's absolutely fair enough. That's their choice. My choice is to do my job in order to earn myself money to have a life, which is what I think I do. And so I wouldn't want to take on so many clients that I no longer have time for anything else in my life whatsoever. But at the same time, you always have to move forwards. And generally speaking, there's a kind of life cycle that happens with writers where the hope is that you would take them on, you would get them placed with a publisher with a reasonable contract, hopefully for more than one book. And that's assuming everything goes very well and books sell, they'll hopefully get recontracted. So once an author is placed, you could argue that quite a large chunk of the agent's initial work at least has been done for that client. There will of course be further work to do for them down the line, editing, working with them, being a confidant. God forbid if that relationship with that publisher breaks down, finding them a new one. But generally speaking, the big chunk of the work comes at the beginning of that relationship. So with that in mind, you could view that kind of cycle as almost sort of coming not to an end, but you've done the chunk of that work and then you have time to focus on other clients. So that's where, that's how an agent like Peter very much views it. He will do a lot of his work, he'll get the client sold, and then he'll start reading again. He'll move on to the next thing, then he'll get them sold and so on and so forth. And he'll have to revisit those earlier clients later down the line, like I said. But generally speaking, there's a cycle that you can repeat and move on and grow your list to a point where you're not overworked, but you are constantly selling. I think that's probably where you would want to end up, which is pretty much where I am now. But there's always space for extraordinary new books.
And you also do a lot of, you kind of offer a lot of advice to people there. I know you've ran kind of pitching workshops, you've offered prizes, kind of one-on-one conversations with people as a prize for competitions. And is it important in your view to try and offer as many avenues as possible for people and writers to get in? Because a lot of the process is quite old-fashioned in terms of the career letter. Is it good to get other avenues of input?
It is, of course. I think anything that you can do that's going to ultimately, being an agent, if you're really kind of black and white about it, is really a numbers game in terms of reading of submissions. So if you were to say that I take on 3 clients a year out of all of the submissions that come in, I'm not even sure if that's accurate. It probably changes year on year. But if I was to take on 3 writers a year, you could argue that out of that total number, if 3 were incredible, if you could double that number of submissions that were coming in, which of course means you have to read twice as many, but if you could double that number, then you could potentially take 6 on in a year and sell them. So taking for granted that you were physically able to do all of the work in order to get those people to those points, those books to those points, it really is a numbers game. And so the point of all of that explanation being that the more you can do to bring more people through your door, submitting to you, knowing who you are, knowing what your taste is, the more likely you are to find those 3, 4, 5, 6 incredible books every year. There's a side to this, of course, which is purely selfish for doing events like that and for doing workshops like that, which is the more of them that you do, the more people know who you are. So we don't have shop windows. Agencies don't have billboards on, tube stations or outside bookshops. We are, our presence is usually relatively limited in terms of a website, which of course we have, Twitter profiles, I suppose, doing stuff on Instagram, maybe doing podcasts like this, of course. So we have to take opportunities where we can, I think, to simply have our names inserted into people's brains. And hopefully the right people, obviously writers, hopefully writers of the kinds of books that we will want to represent and that kind of mesh nicely with our tastes. So there's a selfish side to it, absolutely. But it is important to do those kinds of things. It's actually really important to do those kinds of things to demystify this slightly ridiculous industry. There's so much kind of semi-unintentional gatekeeping that goes on with regard to terminology, with regard to how you even get a book published in the first place. You know, what even is publishing? What does that word mean? These are things that the average person is absolutely within their rights to have no idea what they mean, you know. So I think I actually feel responsible to, it sounds really pompous and trite, but I actually do feel quite responsible for removing some of that mystery and just laying it all bare in front of as many people as possible, because I think that's the only way that we're genuinely going to get real diversity of writing published in this country and around the world, is by removing all of those silly bits of terminology and acronyms that nobody has a clue about, and just saying, this is what it is, this is who we are, this is how you do it. And so I think that kind of thing is really important from that point of view too. And
obviously it seems from the author's side of things at the moment that there is, you know, post-lockdown, there still seems to be there's a lot of competition out there, I think, and it's quite a tough process for people. I mean, what would one piece of advice that you could give aspiring authors that are going through the process at the moment, what would that be?
I think to believe in yourself and believe in your book, because someone somewhere, if you've written a book and you're really happy with it, if it's a book that you would want to read, that you have written, somebody somewhere will also want to read it. Mm-hmm. Hopefully lots of people. So my advice would always be to believe in yourself and believe in your writing, back yourself, and also do your research. That's two things, sorry. The first one's kind of a bit airy-fairy, so we can ignore that one maybe, and just say, do your research, because I think that's absolutely crucial. Knowing as much as you can about the people that you want to submit your book to is going to give you a massive leg up in comparison to people that are just kind of maybe just saying, you're a literary agent, I'm going to send my book to you, without working out what their taste is, who they've represented in the past, where their list might be moving, what they're seeing is exciting. Research as much as possible and ask people questions in order to make that research happen. You know, don't be afraid to reach out to people like me, like editors, like other writers that you might know or might not know, because generally speaking, people that are in publishing it's a bit of a kind of commonly bandied around phrase that publishing is a people industry, but I think for the most part, people are actually really nice who work in books, and I think generally speaking, do our jobs because we really enjoy reading and we love great writing. And that is a commonality that is really useful, I think, for aspiring writers. Use that, reach out to people, buy people a coffee, don't send them a DM on Twitter, you know, email them, whatever it is, because a lot of the time people might not reply, but you've lost nothing in that case, you know? So I think, do your research, believe in yourself, believe in your writing, because if you don't, nobody's going to.
Yeah, cool. Well, those were the main questions that we had for you, but we always end every podcast with the same questions for our guest. The first of which is, what was the last book that you can tell us about that you read?
That I finished, that I read?
Yeah.
What was it? I'll have to think about that. Do you know what? I'm not even sure I can remember.
Yeah, it's a pretty tricky question for agents.
The problem is that I've read so many books. For example, I'm looking at my shelves and I've got Tariq's books on there. I've got Tendai Huchu's books on there. I've got Jeff Matthews' books on there. Adrian Selby's, all sorts of books that I've kind of plowed into my brain as part of my job. It's kind of quite hard to remember the books that I've read for fun. I did read Tade Thompson, Rosewoods. Tade or Tade, I'm not sure. I'm very embarrassed to not know how to pronounce his name. But that book I thought was incredible. I really, really enjoyed it. It was a really cool throwback to a kind of noirish vibe, not far dissimilar actually, Tariq, from your writing in that sense.
Oh, cool, okay.
But also just a really bonkers bit of SF.
Is that the book set in Africa?
Yeah, it's set in Nigeria.
One. Right. I think I might have read that one.
The premise is that a giant fungal alien has landed on the planet.
Yeah, I did read that one.
Completely cut the US off in its entirety. So the US is completely alienated from the rest of the population of the globe. And one of the effects of this alien landing has to cause a small number of people to become somewhat telepathic. And the main character in the book is one of those. And it follows his kind of journey. There's a lot of time shift stuff. There's a lot of leaping between different frames that is quite confusing if you read fast like I do. But it's a terrific book. It's an ambitious, brilliant, fresh bit of SF writing, which I really loved. So yeah, in terms of, I probably have read 2 books since I read that one, but I can't remember what they are. But that one was really, really good. I loved it.
Awesome. What about the last film that you watched?
Midsummer.
Oh, nice.
A couple of nights ago, whilst slightly drunk, and it absolutely scared the pants off me.
Yeah.
It was brilliant. I loved it. I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, it's basically Wicker Man in Sweden with American students, but I really, really liked it. I really loved the vibe. I thought it was stunningly beautiful in a visual sense, which obviously the filmmaker then used to transpose with awful violence and shattered limbs and removed heads and pummeled in items. So it was very cleverly done, but it was also very cool, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought I saw it in the cinema when it came out, and I remember thinking it took that kind of horrible sequence in Hereditary where you kind of, I think it's got the car accident scene, and that kind of horrible, queasy feeling, and it did that for like 2.5 hours, and by the end of it, I was just like a wreck. I was like, my heart was just kind of the whole time. I was like, this felt uncomfortable watching it. It was I mean, it's brilliant, but I don't think I could watch it again in any great hurry. I don't think. Yeah.
I'm not sure I would either know, but it was really clever. I'm quite a fan of. I'm really into Stranger Things as well. I love Stranger Things, and it's quite interesting the slightly kind of psychedelic nature of both Midsummer. I mean, they're obviously very different things, but I'm strangely into psychedelic things going on in movies, whether they're awful or terrifying or really fun. Or I'm not sure that.
That probably answers the next question, which is, what was the last TV show that you watched or are watching?
Stranger Things.
Yeah.
In terms of, I'm halfway through probably about half a dozen other things. I started The Witcher, which I was quite into, but Stranger Things was the last series that I've roared through and finished. Well, it's not even the end of the season, but I've really, really enjoyed that. Nicely nostalgic. I felt like it kind of dipped a little bit in maybe the last season, the one before. The first series was just mind-bogglingly excellent, I thought. And I feel like certainly this first half is a bit of a return to form in that regard. It's very clever. It's good writing. It's fun to watch. It's nostalgic for somebody like me who, grew up with E.T. and
the good news,
Ghostbusters and The Stand and Stand By Me and, basically everything that Stephen King ever wrote, which is like my teenage years. It's really, really cool. It's pitch perfect for me. And awesome. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, the very last thing we always do is a super quick fire either or, and I always say there's no right answer apart from one. But we'll start off with the Battle of the Georges with George R.R. Martin or George Lucas.
George R.R. Martin.
Okay. TV or cinema?
TV.
Night Owl or Early Bird?
Night Owl, 100%.
Fancy restaurant or takeaway?
Takeaway.
And the last one, real book or ebook?
Real book.
Oh, I have no hesitation on that one. I'm always hoping for the ebook, but no, very few people are ebook supporters over the real book, which is fair enough. But
mate.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.